Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Today we will discuss spinal cord. Remember we talked previously about the somatic sensations and how they are transmitted up throughout the spinal cord up to the cerebral cortex. So this represents the first function of the spinal cord, which is nerve impulse propagation. Signals are transmitted through tracts located in the white matter of the spinal cord up to the higher centers in the central nervous system. These tracts can be either sensory or ascending tracts, or it can be motor or descending tracts. Since the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, this means it has some integrative function by processing information and making decisions about a certain information. We are talking mainly about the spinal reflexes, which takes place within the gray matter of the spinal cord that contains the cell bodies of the neurons. The pathway of the reflex, or the circuit for the reflex, is called reflex arc, and it's composed of 5 functional components. The components are sensory receptor, then a sensory neuron, then an integrative center, which is the gray matter of the spinal cord in this case, and a motor neuron or an efferent neuron, and then the effector, which in our case here in this lecture is the skeletal muscles. And when we talk about the skeletal muscles, it's very important to talk about the sensory receptor there, or the proprioceptors, which is muscle spindle. Let's remember together the structure of the muscle spindle. So you know from your musculoskeletal system physiology that the skeletal muscles fibers can be extrafusal muscle fibers or the intrafusal. And these intrafusal muscle fibers are very tiny, small muscle fibers with a special structure that in the center of these fibers there are no or almost very little actin and myosin, so no contraction in this part. On the contrary, the peripheral parts of these intrafusal muscle fibers, they do have actin and myosin, so it can contract. These intrafusal fibers can be categorized into either nuclear bag or a nuclear chain fibers. So the muscle spindle responds to any stimulus of changing muscle length, either stretching or unstretching of the muscle. Either way, this information will go through the sensory neurons, either the primary afferent or group 1A fibers, and the secondary afferent fibers or group 2 fibers. This change in the muscle length or the stretching of the muscle can occur suddenly, and so this dynamic change will activate these group 1A fibers or the primary afferents, which are more responsive to the change in the rate of the contraction. So the motor fiber, because we said on the peripheral part there are actin and myosin, there is motor innervation to them, either static, they are gamma fibers, so it can be static gamma fibers, or dynamic gamma fibers. You know previously again from the MSS that the skeletal muscles, they maintain some sort of tone, which means there are always some sort of activation to these skeletal muscle fibers, and mainly this is the role of the static gamma fibers, whereas the dynamic gamma fibers, they mostly respond to sudden changes in muscle length. So the simplest manifestation of the muscle spindle function is muscle stretch reflex or a deep tendon reflex. Don't confuse it with the Golgi tendon organ. Simply so to elicit this reflex, when the patient comes to your clinic, you'll ask the patient to sit unsupported of the legs, just relaxing, and then you're gonna hit this patellar tendon with the hammer. That will cause stretching in the skeletal muscle, the extensors of the knee, which will activate the muscle spindles, and then the signals will go through the sensory neurons, the 1A neurons mainly, that will go to the anterior horn of the gray matter of the cord, and then synapse with the anterior motor neuron or the alpha motor neurons that will activate and cause contraction in the extrafusal muscles of the muscle that is stretched. This is an important reflex to prevent overstretching and to oppose the stretching with contraction by preventing overstretching and protecting the muscle fibers. This reflex will happen so fast, and that's why it's called the dynamic stretch reflex. It will be done within a fraction of a second. However, there is another type of reflex that will be carried through the type 2 fibers to the central nervous system, and that will cause more prolonged activation and contraction of the muscle. This is again important because it's kind of maintain the continuous smooth contraction and smoothing of these contraction unless the central nervous system decided otherwise. Muscle stretch reflex is characterized by the following. It is monosynaptic, see, ipsilateral, so you know that the skeletal muscles around the limbs are acting as antagonistic muscles. So if we have an extensor, there's also flexors of that joint, and so if you want to do some sort of movement and you contract the extensors, you have to relax the flexors, and that's the role of what we call it reciprocal innervation. So these sensory signals that came to the spinal cord, these nerves will branch, and this branch will interact with an inhibitory interneuron that will supply the motor neuron supplying the antagonistic muscle. So in this case, contraction of this muscle will cause relaxation in the antagonistic muscle. This reciprocal innervation is very important to prevent conflict between these opposing or antagonistic muscles and to coordinate body movements. During voluntary contraction of skeletal muscle, the cerebral cortex and the higher centers, they do activate the alpha motor neurons that will supply the extrafusal muscles and cause contraction of the skeletal muscle. But at the same time, they do activate also the gamma motor neurons, which will supply the intrafusal fibers. And this concept is called co-activation of alpha and gamma motor neuron. This is important to prevent to keep the muscle spindle reflex from opposing the muscle contraction, keep them aligned together. One of the important higher centers that do activate the gamma motor neurons is the bulboreticular facilitatory region in the brainstem, which also gets signals from the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, and the brainstem, the basal nuclei. Now, as a neurologist, they do depend on this muscle stretch reflex in their physical examination of the patients because it's very important to assess this degree of facilitation of the spinal cord centers. So if this reflex will be a higher degree or increase in the facilitation signals, there will be exaggerated reflex, whereas decrease in the facilitation will cause depressed in the muscle jerk or the reflex. And so for more details, we will get to them later on when we talk more about the motor system. But again, examination of the stretch reflex is very important part of the neurological examination. The second spinal reflex that we will learn today is Golgi tendon reflex or tendon reflex. The sensory receptor in this reflex is called Golgi tendon organ, and it's located in the tendon of the skeletal muscles. So it detects changes in the tension of the muscle. Activation of the Golgi tendon organ by increasing the tension, for example, it will activate the sensory neurons that will go to the gray matter of the spinal cord. There, it will synapse on interneuron in the spinal cord. That's an inhibitory interneuron. This in turn will synapse on the anterior motor neuron, resulting in relaxation of this muscle. And so by this will decrease the tension in this muscle and prevent avulsion of the tendon or injury to the tendon and the muscle by the increased tension. Similar to the spindle reflex, the tendon reflex also can be either dynamic reflex, responding to sudden changes in the tension, or a static tendon reflex, that's for going on for a prolonged time and giving the importance of always informing the central nervous system about the situation of the tension as well as the stretch in the case of the stretch reflex in the skeletal muscles. You can also here note that this reflex is polysynaptic because the first synapse is between the sensory neuron and the interneuron, whereas the second one is synapsing on the anterior motor neuron. And it is an ipsilateral reflex. Just like what we explained in this muscle spindle reflex, in the tendon reflex there is also reciprocal innervation, which means there is a branch going to the antagonistic muscle, but here the antagonistic muscles will be activated and contracted since this muscle is relaxed. Again, and just like the spindle reflex, the tendon reflex sensory fibers will give branches to the higher centers in the central nervous system, to the cerebral cortex, the motor area in the cerebral cortex, to the cerebellum, and also to the reticular formation. These are important ascending tracts going to send these proprioceptive information from the tension as well as what we mentioned before as about the stretch and the length of the muscle to these higher centers for further processing. So it's not only this local reflex. Spinal reflexes are not only stimulated by proprioceptive signals, they may be stimulated with any other cutaneous signals. For example, in this flexor or withdrawal reflex, you may flex your arm or legs and withdraw them from just simple or light touch. But most importantly, from pain stimulation, this reflex will be very evident. So pain stimulus activating the nociceptor will cause flexion or withdrawal from this symptom, the signal. Note that this flexor reflex is polysynaptic, so interneurons are involved in this reflex. Not only that, but you can appreciate that this reflex looks more complex than the previous two reflexes because it involves different types of neuronal circuits, such as the divergent circuits, the reciprocal circuits, and the after discharge circuits. The after discharge circuits play an important role to keep this kind of withdrawal from the signal for kind of prolonged time until the central nervous system figure out what to do with this painful signal. Flexor reflex is intersegmental reflex. It has to activate or different skeletal muscles, so on different segments of the spinal cord. But it's still an ipsilateral reflex. All of the signals are on the same side. Flexor reflex initiates a cross-extensor reflex, which will affect the opposite limb. So a signal on one side that will activate this flexor reflex will also activate a contralateral or a cross-extensor reflex. This is important to maintain balance in case of the lower limbs and also to avert or get away from the painful stimulus, especially for the upper limb thing. You can notice here that it's not only one interneuron, it's very complex and so many interneurons are involved and many neuronal circuits, especially the after discharge circuits. And it's also, again, it's intersegmental and contralateral reflex. That's it for today. Thank you.